Thanks, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. I want to start out with a question. How many of you have ever been in the emergency department for yourself, for your child, or for a family member? Okay, now I have another question. How many of you have never been in an emergency department? One, two. Two people in the audience. So I also want to start out by saying, Dr. Orlick said that when you go into a clinic visit or any visit with a child with autism, that you should have a calm affect. Now, I'm just saying, I am known for my exuberant enthusiasm, so I will try and chill it down just a little bit. So what I want to talk about or spend the next few minutes talking about really some of the challenges we have in the special environment of the emergency department, a place that I love that most other people don't love, right? Talk a little bit about the literature with regard to children with autism seen in the emergency department, show you some data from our ED, and we do call it the ED, emergency department. Talk about what we can do to help children that we might not be doing right now, and also talk a little bit about what we are doing. Obviously, and we've been talking about this all day long, if we had all the answers, we wouldn't be having this conference. So I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a taste of what we are doing and can be doing, but we still have many challenges ahead. So let's start out with the fact, this is the problem with the emergency department itself. So this is a child with autism coming into this environment. It's just logarithmically more of a problem. It's a busy environment. It's a new environment. You didn't choose to be here and you didn't make an appointment to come and see me. It's noisy. Our new ED, it has great sound barriers, but it is noisy. There is a ton of stimulation. There are so many children coming in and out. And we do not have a separate waiting room. We don't have space for a separate waiting room. We did talk about it when we were building the new ED. Could we have a low stim place? It just wasn't possible. Long wait times. Waiting is always a huge issue for any child, but for kids with autism, it's an even bigger problem. And it's really the stress of having an urgent issue. Everybody says we need to have prep time. We need to prepare these kids. We need to prepare ourselves. We need to think about it. There is no prep time. You have to go to the emergency department. That's why it's an emergency department. And then a lot of these children require procedures, which means we have to do a lot of touching. And how do we prepare for that? And how do we make that situation as good as it can be for these kids? And then we put these children in a room that is full of medical equipment and say, don't touch anything in this room. Are you kidding me? Right? Okay, we'll talk about that. And then there's really the staff knowledge of autism and how to help us care for these kids. So preparedness and flexibility, which Dr. Orlick talked about, are really tough to do sometimes in an emergency department setting. So let's talk a little bit about what the literature says about healthcare usage and emergency department usage. So in a recent study that looked at medical utilization for kids with autism, first of all, the common reasons for seeking care, respiratory problems, well, that's kind of all kids. Digestive problems, much more common in kids with autism, and behavioral issues in addition. In this one study, they were 1.1 times more likely than children without ASD to visit the emergency department, but had more than twice as many healthcare visits annually, and four times the healthcare expenditures. And I think that really speaks to some of those comorbidities that you were talking about. And that really adds to the cost. So what about the emergency department itself? This was a recent study looking at emergency department uses, and I love the title, Do Children with Autism Overutilize the Emergency Department? I don't know what that means. For me, when people say, why are they here? They are here because they're scared or they don't have another resource. So to me, I don't call it overutilization. It's utilization. And in particular, in this study, in a tertiary care hospital with more than 100,000 children seen over a 3-year period, the children were older. That makes sense than the typical child throughout the emergency department because we tend to see a lot of young kids. Male was more common than female in the children with autism. Also, that makes sense. And in addition, these children were noted to have less urgent issues and were more frequently discharged, which is another sign that some of their issues were less urgent. And I wonder, and they didn't speak to this in this study, if this really has to do with some of the access to care issues that we were talking about earlier. And I think that it likely does. So this article totally amused me. It is an absolutely recent article from Pediatric Emergency Care, talking about managing children with autism in the emergency department. I was so excited for this because I'm preparing for this talk, and I'm like, this is going to give me all the answers, and this is what my talk is going to be about. And then it said, and these were the conclusions: set up appointments for elective visits. What elective visits? That's the emergency department. There's no elective visits. I don't know what that means. And create structured environments in hospitals. Okay. Early identification in the ED setting, I could relate to that. Are we asking the question, what special needs does your child have that we can help make this a better visit for them? That's kind of a global question that we could ask. And then care plans or information from parents on how to best interact with their child. Now, we've talked a lot in the emergency department about online continuous care plans, and the problem that we run into with those is keeping them up to date. It's a huge, huge issue. So I think it's even better if a parent comes with a care plan for their kid. This is what works for my child, so we can do it, so we can do what they ask. And this is from a paper that, where's Lynn? Lynn Vigo wrote with Charlotte Lewis, Louise Warren, and myself. And we actually, this is actually in the journal Pediatric Dentistry, so we just really talked about the dental problems in this particular article, but we really were asking parents, what issues come up with you when you're trying to get dental care for your child and emergency care? So this is really a summary of everything that parents said. This is what they told us. We don't want to wait. So it's great for dental visits. You can have appointments at the beginning of the day, or I could say a million times, parents were like, just give me a pager. Just give me a pager and I'll go back out to the car or I'll go wherever. We actually legally can't see a kid come into the emergency department and then send them back to the car because we're no longer monitoring them. But it would be super cool if we could, because I think that's a great idea. But things we can do: individualized approach to care, focus on what works for the specific child. And again, when you've seen a child with autism, you've seen a child with autism. And parents really, really want input on the process and the decision making. So when you're in the emergency department and a child has a laceration repair, really they want to talk about what are the options here. So I saw a child with autism in the ED 2 days ago, and the child had a laceration right by the eye. And we actually had an honest discussion. What will this look like cosmetically if we do nothing? Because we can't just give a mild sedative to this child. How can we examine this so that we can get a better look at it? And thank goodness when we got a better look, it didn't need sutures. But if it did, we would have had a major process for a teeny little cut to repair, because a little oral or intranasal sedative wasn't going to do the job. And we had to have that honest conversation together and figure out how best to examine and the decision to make. I think this is another thing that we haven't really looked at, and maybe we can study this a little bit, is parents want to know the plan and discuss the plan and management without distraction. Now, in the emergency department, in that room, which ours are pretty large, but we'll say in that room with the door closed, it can be really hard for parents to hear what we want to tell them. And so, what can we do in that situation? I'll give another example. I saw a child who had an abscess that we had to drain. We did it under general anesthesia in the emergency department. And when he woke up, not a happy camper. He wouldn't stop screaming. And I had a conversation with the mom, and I said, do you want me to try a sedative? Or, how do you think we ought to go about this? And he cried for about 45 minutes, and I had to make sure he was safe to discharge. And finally she looks at me and she says, I just want to go home. I think it'll be better when we go home. So I couldn't give her instructions. He was screaming. So they went home, and about an hour later I called her, and I heard quiet. So that was good. And we talked about, okay, this is how you're going to manage the abscess that we drained, and these are the things to look for. And that's a much better situation. That's something we can do in the emergency department. We can call families back and give them instructions if it's kind of a heightened situation. It was hard because we also had to make sure it was safe for him to go, and I've actually never sent home a child from the emergency department screaming that hard. So it was really stressful for me, and I was pretty shaken by the whole situation myself. But those are things that we can do. So let's talk about Seattle Children's Emergency Department. We have this beautiful new ED, and we see over 40,000 kids per year. That's a lot of kids. 1 in 5 kids that we see are admitted to the hospital, so that means that the kids that we see are pretty high acuity, they're pretty sick. In fact, of all the admissions to the hospital, half are like surgical patients or direct admissions, and all the rest, more than 50%, come straight from the emergency department. We have a communications center to coordinate care for the 5-state region, WWAMI region, and we really care for the sickest kids in this region. This is really important because that's true of most children's emergency departments, and that impacts how much time we have to have these lengthy discussions with families about what's best for their kids. In our ED, in 2015, we saw a total of almost 43,000 kids. Of those kids, there were about 1,200 who came through that had a diagnosis of autism listed somewhere on their chart when we did an IS data pool. So that's about 2.8% of all the kids seen in the emergency department. It's probably a little bit higher because not all of them probably have that diagnosis listed. Of those 1,200 children, 930 came in for a medical problem, and by that I mean not a mental health or behavioral issue. So 77% of all the kids seen in the emergency department with autism were seen for a medical problem. And then looking at mental health, that means 33% were seen for a mental health issue, which is about 13% of all the children seen in the emergency department for mental health issues. We had about 2,100 children seen for mental health issues, of which about 284 had autism. This is important because this goes to how can we keep the ED safe for these children? So let me just talk about something we call a code purple. A code purple, and this is the direct definition from the child website. A code purple is initiated when a behavior poses a threat to self, others, or property. A trained team then responds to code purple situations. So me as a physician, if a code purple is called, I just step back and I let the experts take care of it, right? I never put hands on. And neither do they unless they really have to, and it's a major safety issue. So in our emergency department, of those almost 43,000 children seen, less than 1% of the time for all of the patients seen do we have to call a code purple. For all patients seen in the emergency department with autism, about 5% of the time we'll call a code purple. For our mental health patients, all mental health patients seen in the ED, about 6.5% of the time. And if you have autism and a mental health or behavioral problem, about 14% of the time. This is just to give you a picture of the needs that some of these kids have, and are we meeting them? This is in an emergency department where we have put a tremendous amount of effort into creating a safe and a calm environment, a tremendous amount of effort, and even in this environment, we still have a lot of need for our Code Purple team. So what can we do? What else can we do to create an even safer and more conducive environment for care in an emergency department setting? Well, I think everyone has said this, knowledge is the key. It's super duper important. And I'm just gonna quote Dr. Orlick, because I know I'm quoting you again. Behavior is communication. I just loved that statement, behavior is communication. I might say that 3 or 4 more times. Because that's part of the knowledge that I think we have to impart to ourselves and to our colleagues. We really, really need our parents to give us guidance and caregivers to give us guidance, and we need to ask them. I think we need in the primary care setting to tell parents, you need to tell people in other settings what you need. That's what we need. We need to tell them, empower them to tell us But if they're not telling us, then we need to ask. We need their guidance so much. And we can do a lot of things to help these kids. Now, you might say to me, oh, this is so simple. This is so simple. Just when parents come in to the emergency department, just ask them what they need. Well, I mean, why aren't you doing that? Why aren't we doing that? Well, I don't know. If a kid comes in and has a big laceration here and there's blood all over the place, and we're trying to stem the bleeding, and he's screaming and the parents are crying, it's hard to ask that question. Or if there's 4 people waiting to come into the emergency department and one of them is really having a lot of difficulty breathing, we're going to go a little quicker to get to that person. That's why, because it's so simple. When you just think about it, it seems so simple, but in reality, it gets a little bit harder. So we can provide time to process. And I tell this to the residents in the emergency department all the time. I tell them in a different way. You have time to think, that's what I say. Don't rush, you have time to think, except for anaphylaxis, right? Okay, that's the only time, you just act. But you generally have time to think, which means we have time for these kids to process, and we have time to think about what's going to work best for them. We can provide comfort. We can provide distraction. And we have lots of ways to do that in the ED. And I think almost most importantly, all of these are really important. Reassurance is important, but control is really, really important. When you come to the emergency department, and you've seen this with family members and yourself, you feel a lack of control. It's a foreign environment. The words that people are using are technical and don't make a lot of sense. We have to find a way to give these children and their families control in a difficult setting. We can provide sedation. We have a lot of tools, better and better tools over time for providing sedation, especially for procedures. And we have child life specialists, about 50 hours a week. We would love to have them 24/7 in our emergency department who really help with preparation and explanation for these kids. And not only do they help the children, but they help the other staff to learn how to do the same thing. So when there's not a child life specialist in the emergency department and a resident is sewing up a patient, I'll look at them and I'll say, I'm the child life specialist, you're sewing up this laceration. And so we split up our roles. Don't try and do both, that's what I say. They always, they do. What can families do for us? They can help us help them with their child. They can inform us from the start of the visit because they don't always do that. And they can provide us with a care plan and tell us what works. That's what we want to know from their previous experiences. We want to know what works. So expeditious care, when we built this emergency department, we built it to provide care quickly. They see a nurse in the lobby who does a quick registration in RED. This is what we're doing to make it better. And that's the time when families can tell us what works for their kid. They're brought straight back to a room in an ideal state when it's not too busy, and they're triaged in the room. So they don't have to get registered and sit down and triaged and sit down and then go to a room. We try and do everything in the same room, all of their care, for every single patient, whether they're on the autism spectrum or not. We have 4 safe rooms in the emergency department for behavioral and mental health patients, and between every 2 rooms there's a porch, and we had to add 5 safe rooms to meet capacity in RED. That's how many mental health patients come through. And this is an example of the visibility that we have in our emergency department. We can have situational awareness. This is our board. It has a what's next column, and this says needs a low stim room. We can tell everybody what a child needs just by looking up on the board. We can help in that way. So if it was really easy, we would see each child right away, provide seamless care, and never need to call a code purple. But it's not quite that easy all the time, is it? Because the ED is a high-stress environment. But we can make a difference because behavior is communication. We can create a safe environment, we can decrease stimulation, and we can understand and individualize care to each child's needs by working together. Are we there yet? I'll leave that question to you. And I'd love to finish up by saying to everybody with autism, for us to know if they can't learn the way we teach, then we need to teach the way they learn. And for all of those parents, a special shout out, parents who have children with special needs also have special needs. They need to know more than the average parent. They need to do more than the average parent. They need more patience than the average parent, and so much more. Thank you.